least one activity, hopefully two, so that we can kind of join in and have a conversation. Hiya, Stacey from Jamaica. I'm hopefully out in Jamaica next year, next February time, running some workshops. So come and say hello when I'm out in Jamaica. Hopefully running 4 or 5 workshops around Jamaica. So we're looking at Max Maths, particularly thinking about the Singapore approach. I'm the lead author on Max Maths. There's 5 names listed on the cover. Myself and Alice Hanson wrote the first edition between us. Andrew did a lot of work on the second edition as well, a colleague called Andrew Jeffrey. The 3 of us are all from the UK. Andrew is based in the south of UK, Alice in Lancashire, and myself in Yorkshire. And then you'll see 2 other names, Daniel Cole and Barinderjeet Kaur. They're actually colleagues who wrote a program called Target Maths, which is actually a program written in Singapore. And so my first contact with them was a visit to Singapore to explore the changes and the developments we'd make to turn Target Maths into Max Maths. I always kind of find it interesting when we have particular approaches in particular parts of the world that become adopted globally by teachers, become popular, usually popular because they find that this particular approach has an impact in their classroom. I remember it's probably about 20 years ago that I first visited Singapore and Southeast Asia, that part of the world. And I was visiting the Singapore government to talk to them about developing the Singapore curriculum around a more problem-solving approach. So the approaches that appear new are always based on something before, but are a development, but are a thoughtful development, and so worth taking notice of. And I think what I'll try and do in the next hour, the webinar lasts an hour, is talk about my understanding of the Singapore approach, and therefore the Singapore approach that's contained within Max Maths, because there are always particular slants on particular approaches. And to be honest, it's the what is now called the Singapore approach is a way that I've been working in my classrooms for, I'm quite an old man now. I've been teaching for 45 years. And I remember when I first started teaching, trying to find teachers who were also interested in what I was then calling a problem-solving approach. And that means approaching teaching and learning mathematics through problems, some real life and some within the mathematics itself, but we learn mathematics through solving problems. If you think about the way that professional mathematicians work, they set themselves a problem in mathematics that nobody else has yet solved, and they spend a long time working on that problem. They don't go into lessons where somebody tells them how to do it. They have to work out how to do it for themselves. The other thing I think that's interesting about what I call professional mathematicians, university mathematicians, is that one of the things that's absolutely sacrosanct for them is the coffee break and the staff room. And that's not because mathematicians particularly like coffee. It's because that within the staff room, they have conversations about the problems they are engaged in, and they find that collaborative approach really useful. And I think actually the Singapore approach is the approach that professional mathematicians take. So actually, what we're not necessarily, what maybe what you got in school and what I got in school was that I was often just given mathematics to do, asked to complete calculations, maybe what the Singapore approach does is develop mathematicians. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So we're going to think about my interpretation of the Singapore approach, how manipulatives and the CPA approach link together, because they're two things that are particularly embedded both in Max Maths and the Singapore approach. CPA, concrete pictorial abstracts, as I'm sure you know. And that by the end of an hour, that you kind of understand and are more confident in using Max Maths in the classroom, or taking control of Max Maths in the classroom, so your classrooms become active places and become places where children become problem solvers and become mathematicians. While I'm talking, it would be interesting to know from the people, from you in the chat, if you are using Max Maths, or if you come in because you're interested in maybe using Max Maths, or just generally interested in some CPD around mathematics, because I hope whichever of those three it is that you'll find the session useful. Whenever I begin a session, or whenever I'm working on some CPD, I always ask people to do some mathematics to start off with. Thanks, Josiane. Whereabouts are you, Josiane? I'm going to guess Mexico or somewhere just from the name, but that could be completely wrong. I want you to imagine that you're going to start counting now. Okay, whatever time it is in your country, 7 minutes past the hour, you're going to start counting, and you're going to start counting aloud. You're going to say 1, 2, 3, and so on. And you're going to keep counting until you get to 5 million. And I want you to try and work out how long that would take. How long would it take you to say every number from 1 to 5 million in order out loud? Okay, you need to decide things like, you need to decide if you could have when you would have rests, how many rests you might need. But I actually want to, hi Shimar from Saudi Arabia, I want an estimate of how long that would take you, and I'll explain why I'm starting with that calculation in 5 minutes when we've had to go. And can you put your thoughts in the chat? So imagine that we're sitting in a small group, and you're kind of saying your thinking out loud, how you're going to work on this problem. So part of working on a problem, I think, is taking ownership of the problem and starting saying, okay, well, I think a way I might approach this is. So first of all, how might you approach this problem? And then we'll move on to coming up with some calculation. So don't be frightened about going in the chat. We had plenty of people in the chat this morning. And it's actually a problem that's been around for a while, and I'll explain why in a few moments. Thanks, Rosas. And I like your probably. And I think one of the things that I think is really, really important in our classrooms is to allow learners to be tentative. We want to know what they're thinking in that moment. Giving that sort of space to learners is so important, and giving ourselves space to listen to what their thoughts are. While you're working, I'll say one of the things that, again, that I said this morning. If you take nothing else away from this webinar, if you do nothing else as a result of this webinar, tomorrow in your lessons, give yourself 30 seconds where you go and stand somewhere so the students aren't aware of you, and you just listen to what they're saying. I'm hoping that in your classroom, there is a buzz of students working on a problem. And I'm hoping that what you can then do is listen carefully to what they're saying, like I'm trying to listen to what you're thinking now. And that will give you an idea about their learning process, which we'll talk a bit more about later on. And it will move you away from just focusing on your teaching to focusing on the students' learning. And hopefully you'll be able to get to a stage where you can take a minute or 2 minutes out of your role as a teacher and becoming a listener to what the students are saying. So Rosa, 1 second per number. So that would say 5 million seconds, but in my head, I still don't know how long 5 million seconds is. Now, Marcella has got up to 1.5 years. I'd be interested in how you made that calculation, Marcella, or if that is an estimate just based on thinking, oh, it would take ages. Yeah, Loredana, apologies if I say people's names wrong, but I think it's really important to try and say the names. One of the disadvantages with Zoom is I can't actually hear you say your name properly. So I hope, Loredana, I'm saying your name right. Big apologies if I'm saying it wrongly. But thank you for your comment. Yeah, 1 second a number is okay for the small numbers, probably even 101, 102, 103. That's probably about a second a number. But by the time we get to 3,426,510, 4,326,511. Thank you. And now I forgot what I said, Loredana. Thank you very much, though. I'm sure it wasn't perfect. You're too kind. It's obviously taking more than 1 second. So taking that into account, let's think about maybe starting off with how many seconds that might be, and then do some calculating around the seconds to think about, is that days or months or years? How long is that? What day might I finish on if I started today? Maybe we can all have a think about how, if we're now agreeing it's more than 5 million seconds, how many seconds might it be? And then how can we calculate how many days is that? And then can we calculate how many months that might be? We'll just spend another couple of minutes on that. Another thing to get used to as a teacher, I think, and I'm not very good at it, is being quiet. Being quiet to let people get on with things and not interrupting their thought process, which I'm doing now. It's always harder to not interrupt when you're distant and I can't see what you're doing. Morning, Shamara. I said to a colleague of yours from Jamaica who joined earlier on, Stacey. I'm actually in Jamaica in next February, running a whole series of workshops. Whereabouts in Jamaica are you, Shamara? Whereabouts in Jamaica are you? So, any thoughts about how long it would take in days and months? Marcella reckons 1.5 years. Do we think more or less? I hope you've already realized that there are no wrong answers. There are just conversations that get us closer to an answer. Rose asked, did you get anywhere with working out how long in days 5 million seconds is? Are you working on it? Have you got an idea how to do it? And have you got a calculator? Because you need a calculator for this activity. It would take days, and obviously we can break say we go for 10 million seconds, which is what somebody this morning went for. We can divide that by 60 to find how many minutes. Then we can divide that by 60 to find how many hours. Then we divide that by 24. Brilliant. Thanks, Raneem. Raneem has just done that for me. So Raneem is going for 2 months. Manjula said 2 to 3 months, so I'm guessing you're working on the same. Yeah, brilliant. What's lovely about this sort of thing is that things go quiet, and it happens in classrooms, doesn't it? And then suddenly there's kind of a breakthrough as people start thinking, oh, what we could do is, and then we start to get solutions. So the latest one in is Carlos, 57 days without breaks. So obviously, if we take breaks, it's going to take longer than 57 days. Pardon me, 57 days. 57 days is a couple of months, and Manjula and Raneem are both going for a couple of months, but that's without breaks. So I guess if we counted for 12 hours a day and slept for 12 hours a day, that will give us 4 months, and so on. I worked on this activity with some teachers in Belize. I'm lucky enough to be doing quite a lot of work in Belize at the moment, a place that's adopted a version of Max Maths for the whole country. So the whole of Belize is using a version of Max Maths called My BZ Maths. And that teacher calculated that if he was going to go into his classroom the day after the workshop, start counting when he'd taken the register, and do nothing in any lesson but count. So the kids could have the breaks and lunch and everything, and go home. But every lesson would just be counting. And this was a session in late November. He said we would finish at the end of term next year. So they would do nothing but count till the end of term next year. I don't know if any of you have heard of Mr. Beast, who's a big YouTuber. I hadn't until my 11-year-old grandson. I asked him to work on this because I ask all of my grandchildren to work on Max Maths. And he said, oh, Mr. Beast has done it. And so we went online and we discovered that this YouTuber actually counted to 100,000. And it was his breakthrough video, which I find quite bizarre, that somebody's breakthrough YouTube video should just be counting. He was literally just counting on the video. And it took him 40 hours to get to 100,000. So Felix was using that to help him work out how long it would take. And first of all, he just multiplied by 10 to get to 1 million. But then he realized that the numbers beyond 100,000 take longer to count than before 100,000. Somebody called Jeremy Harper, there's actually a record in this. He counted for 16 hours a day for 89 days to count to 1 million. So if we counted for, if we double that number, giving ourselves 12 hours on, 12 hours off, that's about 6 months. So the number is somewhere around 6 months. One of the reasons I use this as an activity is because I think it reminds students, it reminds you, it reminds teachers that I do this activity with, that mathematics is often about making assumptions, and we are in control of the assumptions that we make. I deliberately said there are no wrong answers, and I deliberately said about people being tentative and bringing forward conjectures, because I think that that's being mathematical, and that's the sort of classroom that I want. I don't want students in my classroom asking me how to do it. I want students in my classroom sharing their mathematical thinking, and that we become mathematical together. And it might be in the process of solving a problem like this, I might teach them a skill. So Ranim shared a skill with us. So I could teach that particular skill, but as a way of getting to a solution to a problem. And this kind of models that. It's not an answer that I've got in my head. I can share some thoughts about possible answers, but there are a whole range of answers depending on the assumptions that we make. And the other reason we do it, and I'll talk about the discrepancy between 6 million and 5 million in a minute, is that the first time I worked on this activity, I think it was probably about 25 years ago. And I was training teachers in Nottingham University in the Midlands in the UK, and it was World Holocaust Day. And I've always thought that mathematics should engage with big historical events, with social issues, with political issues, because it's a way of us understanding the world. It's a way of understanding the real world in a more vivid way. And if we just know the fact that 6 million, in this case, Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, that number is too big to get our heads around, to have an understanding of. If we know that if we started counting today and we wouldn't finish for 6 months, which is October, November, December, January, February, March, next April, we might finish counting. If we counted for 12 hours a day, it would probably take us to the end of your school year if we just did it in school time. Suddenly that number becomes immense. And I think that gives us a clearer, maybe is a better word, a clearer understanding of what 6 million feels like. And when I was working on this a few years ago, I came across this statistic that half of the people in my country don't even know that as a figure. Now, you've probably noticed that I was using 5 million rather than 6 million. I said that colleagues in Belize are using a version of Max Maths, an adaptation called MyBZ Math in their country. And I use 5 million in that book because that is the number of people forcibly taken from Africa to the Caribbean, Latin America, and America as part of the slave trade. And then we can break it down into different parts of the region, but suddenly that 5 million becomes clearer, that the immensity of that number. And I think there's something to be thought about in terms of the relationships between the 6 million and the 5 million and other genocides around the world. So part of my reason for teaching mathematics is to allow people to get a better understanding of the world that they live in. I don't do that because I want to make people feel bad or depressed. I do that because I think if we have a clear understanding, we can take action, we can do something about it. And I genuinely believe that our mathematical confidence builds self-confidence and allows us to take action, allows us to say, I don't think that's right. I don't think that's fair. I want to do something about that. We also know that if we succeed mathematically, we're more likely to get a better paid job. So a better education gives us access to more careers, gives us access to more life chances. You all know that because we all agree on that, all from all around the world. You also know that mathematics has a particular role to play in that. That mathematics is seen as quite an important subject in terms of access to future careers. And I also think that it does have an impact on our self-esteem. Feeling not very good at mathematics, we take that more seriously than if we're not very good at history, or if we're not very good at music, or if we're not very good at geography. Maths, we feel, is more important and more tied up with our self-esteem. So this this webinar and the books aren't particularly about selling the Singapore approach. The Singapore approach is a way of empowering more people through mathematics. So what might the Singapore approach be? I used AI to generate this statement. I'm always quite interested in what AI might come up with. The things that AI is good at is summarizing what has gone before. It's not very good at doing new things, but it's very good at summarizing what has gone before, although sometimes it makes mistakes, or sometimes we might not agree with it, and that is okay, and I'll explain that as I go through it. So, concrete pictorial abstract, that's the framework that it's based on. Those are the kind of initials that go with the Singapore approach. Fewer topics in greater depth. That obviously depends on which country you were in beforehand, because some countries already taught fewer topics than other countries. And some countries teach topics in different orders than other countries, which in itself I think is interesting. There's not a set order in which we should teach topics, and there's not necessarily a set progression. The important thing in there is the idea of a spiral curriculum, coming back to ideas again and again as they develop, using hands-on concrete objects and pictorial representations. And then I changed it, and apologies for the slide with the to and the a together. AI separated out concrete objects, pictorial representations, and then abstract symbolic notation as kind of a development, as a three-stage development. I don't think it's necessarily a three-stage development. I think there are three aspects of learning mathematics, and that we can move through them in different orders. Hi Aisha in Qatar. Hi Abir. My dad was a design engineer. My dad is 96 on Saturday. He's still with us, which is wonderful. And he designed machines that made plate glass. So he's a highly skilled design engineer. Somebody would come to him and say, we need to design a machine that will make glass. Thanks, Rosas. It is. Which will make car windscreens, so that I don't want flat glass. I need glass that will be curved, and it needs to be 3 millimeters thick. And the first thing my dad would do was a sketch. The next thing he would do is a model made out of cardboard. So he created concrete objects even at that stage. He was obviously well beyond the Piagetian stages. So the idea of them being stages comes from Piaget, which is a long time before Singapore. And he suggested things happened in stages, and you finished the concrete stage and moved on to the pictorial stage. I don't think learning math is necessarily like that. I do think that conceptual understanding and critical thinking is around students seeing problems and working on them for themselves to find solutions. And that's what I was trying to model with that problem at the beginning, is giving you time to see it for yourself and then come up with a solution. And you did. I could have said, what's 5 million divided by 60 divided by 60 divided by 24? That was the calculation that you were doing. And that would have been very much quicker. If you got a calculator, you would have all agreed on an answer, and we might have moved on. But what you wouldn't have been developing is a conceptual understanding and a deeper understanding of the nature of that as a number. So that's my sense. That's what I take away from the Singapore approach. Now let me share to you what that means in my world and in that beautiful little boy's world. That's Tate. I should be with Tate. I should have picked Tate up from school an hour ago. He would have run out of school, thrown his arms around me and said, "Grandad," because normally on a Monday, I go over to Manchester where they live, which is about an hour's drive from where I am, and collect them from school and look after them for the next couple of days. But I'm missing him. but it's lovely to be talking to you instead. This is a few years ago, so he's 8 at the moment, and I think he was 4 in this picture, so I think it's 4 years ago, and we were playing a game called Stepping Stones. And the game is we had a set of cards, set of digit cards, 0 to 9. There's 10 stepping stones there. I've written 10 bottom left, 100 in the bottom right. And the game is you have to pick 2 cards up. That gives you 2 digits, 2 different digits if I've just got one set of cards. And then you decide which 2-digit number you want to make. So you can see at one stage he's picked a 1 and a 5. I'll talk about that in a moment. When you make a number, you have to decide where to stick it in that on the stepping stones before you make the next number. So there's some prediction that needs to go on there. Now, I knew that Tate could count to 100 because he counted to 100 regularly, very excitedly. I wasn't sure how deep an understanding Tate had of the numbers to 100. So part of playing this game was to do with that. So I gave him a 100 square to use to help him with ordering numbers. Okay, it's always interesting to me when we make decisions about whether or not children understand something, because there are different levels of understanding to everything, aren't there? And how deep that understanding might be. I want to draw your attention to 2 things. His name is Tate Morris. My guess is that you could all read Tate Morris. But notice that he's used a 3 instead of an S, and notice that there's kind of a reverse 9 instead of an A. And if you look at the other 9s in the grid, 9 is obviously a number that he's starting to form. Who knows why he's confident with 4 and not yet confident with 9? I'm not somebody who spends a lot of time just on forming numbers, because if we write numbers a lot when we're doing mathematics, we learn number formation in the course of doing the mathematics. I want to draw your attention to the number between 49 and 77. He's not quite got his 7s right yet at this point, has he? So Tate picked a 1 and a 5, wrote 1 5 in the stepping stone. As he wrote that, he said 51. I didn't say anything. I just wrote, you can see there's a different font above. I wrote 5-1, and I said, what have I written, Tate? And he said, 51, Grandad. And I said, what have you written? And he said, 5th. How do you spell 51? So I think at that stage, he's seeing numbers, he's seeing the individual digits as symbols that are the same as letters, which say something. And if you arrange them in the right order, they spell a number. So 49 spells 49. When I see a 4 and a 9 in that order, I say 49. What he doesn't know yet is that means 4 10s and 9 1s. So as a teacher, I now know that's my next step with Tate, which is what you get from giving your chance to listen to where the student's thinking is, rather than trying to kind of guess what their understanding is. So it wasn't a matter of that's not right. It was a conversation around spelling, and who knows what was going on in his head at that point. But I do know that now, a few years on, he has no problem with S's or 9s, and he has no problem with place value. That was part of his development of understanding place value. And I kind of thought that was the end of the activity, and was putting things away. And he said, thanks, Rosas. And it's hard to do that, isn't it? It does change everything, particularly our thinking. I think it also develops their thinking, because in having to explain their answers to us, they have to think more deeply about it. And that's the deeper conceptual understanding, because you know, Rosas, that by teaching something, by you explaining something to your students, you get a better understanding of that concept yourself that you didn't necessarily get from school, from when a teacher was telling you about it. Anyway, I told you that Tate had 100 square, and we were kind of putting that away, tidying up. And he said, "How old are you, Grandad?" And I said, "I'm at that stage. It's 4 years ago. I'm 62, Tate. I'm not telling you how old I am now." And he said, "Is that a big number?" He didn't say, "Are you old?" He said, "Is that a big number?" And I said, "I don't know. What do you think?" I think that's another quite a good teacher cue for getting student understanding. What do you think? And he looked at the 100 square, 100 grid, and he said, "Oh, no, it's not too big. It's just over halfway." So remember, this is a 4-year-old, but he's exploring mathematics given the pictorial representations that he's got. I was quite pleased that I wasn't too big a number, because I was just more than halfway, and again thought I'd finished that conversation. And Tate said, how old was Grandad Bill when he died? And I said, "Oh, I think he was 88, Tate." And he looked at the 100 grid and he said, "Oh, that is quite old." So I think part of the Tate's thinking was, how much longer has my granddad got? Oh, it's quite a small number. It looks like he's got quite a long time left. And that Grandad Bill was fairly near the end of the 100 grid. And in that moment for Tate, 100 was the limit, and Grandad Bill was somewhere near the limit. And I think that is an example of somebody seeing a mathematical problem. He's found a solution to the game, but he's certainly not just memorizing things that I'm telling him. And we're still not finished. The next day, you can see behind Tate's left ear, there's a kitchen side. You can see there's a dangerous knife on the chopping board that I should have moved. He was making pancakes with his dad on that same chopping board, standing on a stool he could reach, and they were weighing out flour. And his dad, Ben, said, "We need 120 grams, Tate." And I wondered what would happen. And Tate was counting out the numbers that he could see on the weighing scales, 75, 90, and then stopped. And I assumed it had stopped because we got into 3 digits. And then Tate said, "Why have you stopped, Daddy?" And his dad said, "Well, we've got 120 grams now." And Tate said, "Is that number?" pointing to the weighing scales, maths in the real world. And his dad said, "Yeah, that's 120. And Tate turned around to me and nearly fell off his stool and said, "Grandad, there's numbers bigger than 100. So yesterday, in Tate's world, numbers went up to 100. Suddenly they go up to 120, and he could count even further. So becoming mathematical, becoming a mathematician. How does Max Maths support that way of working, that idea? Because it's all very well talking about me working one-on-one with my grandson, isn't it? That's not me in a classroom with all your kids all day, every day. Although all my grandsons have done all of the Max Maths books that they're up to and really enjoy them and get quite excited about these webinars, because it means that tomorrow we always have a world map and they can find all the different countries that you've all come from and what the time was when you came on the webinar, and why did people in Jamaica get up at 5 a.m. this morning to go on the web rather than wait for the evening. I'll quickly go through this. I sense that most of you are using maths just from a couple of answers earlier on. The main thing I want to talk about, I think, is the images, that they're deliberately colourful images that relate to real life, because I want students to see mathematics as colourful and creative and exciting. I think that's really important. Not those textbooks that we might have had, which were just pages and pages of exercises. Okay, that's not mathematics. That's doing calculations. This is becoming mathematical. You need to know, the students need to know what it is that we're going to be working on. So the opening spread always has the objectives for that unit, and again sets that in a real world context. And there's an activity which says this is why we're working on numbers up to 20. You know that throughout those avatars appear throughout the books, and there's always speech bubbles. Those speech bubbles are what I hope I would hear in your classrooms. So in your classrooms, I want to hear the students talking, and if they're not talking, those are little cues for them and for you to have a conversation about. Scaffolding, I think, is part of the Singapore approach. It's part of the spiral curriculum, and each unit goes through a let's learn together, which is often a teacher-led investigation or activity. Let's try it, which will be students working together in smaller groups, and a let's practice, which might be students individually or in pairs working on activities. And that's the scaffolding. So it flows from all together with support from the teacher and each other, to pairs and groups with support from other students in the group, to individuals or maybe pairs. I never work in groups smaller than pairs, except for some kids who actually prefer to work on their own, a bit like me. I will let them work on their own, but ask them to explain things to everybody later on. And so you can see that all of that is cooperative, and then plenty of games and investigations in the heads together. So you'll get used to that flow, and I think part of the routine of a classroom is that students get used to how a book works. So I think it's quite important that books follow a particular rhythm, and I think it's important for you that books follow a particular rhythm. Going to spend a little bit of time on counting and then quickly whiz through some pages looking at the different representations. Five principles. Again, I don't think these go in a particular order. I don't think you learn one and then two and then three. I think we move around these five. You probably know these. It's Gelman and Gellistel came up with this in the 1930s. One-to-one means that we just count anything once. That's why we touch things. We go 1, 2, 3, 4, and touch the thing that we're counting. That's why sometimes it's useful to hold children's fingers while we count, because otherwise they'll go 1, 2, 3, touch the next thing, 4, 5, touch the next thing, 6. You'll have seen that in young kids. Stable order principle, that we always say the numbers in the same order. That's why we sing number songs and number rhymes. And if you think about it, that's not common sense. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are the only series of words that we always say in exactly the same order. Usually we decide which order we're going to say words in. The cardinal principle says that the last thing we count tells us how many there are, which is why when we're counting, we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Raise our voice. So if we touch 6 things, we know there are 6 things. Abstraction means that we can count anything. So I could have red beads and green beads in front of me. I can say, how many beads are there? I can say, how many red beads are there? I can say, how many green beads are there? And that means I could say, how many more green beads are there than red beads? So that's starting to move on towards abstraction. That's why that's called the abstraction principle. And then the order irrelevance principle, I'll talk about on the next slide, but one, what that is. But just a quick story about another of my grandchildren. This is Quinn. Quinn is now started school in the UK. You start school in the year that you become 5. He's 2. Well, I think he's a bit younger than 2 because he's not using words yet. He's verbalizing to the extent that he will have shouted at me and pointed at the dominoes box, meaning I want to play with the dominoes. And his mathematical activity that he set himself is arranging dominoes on his tray, and he's trying to see how, he's not counting them, but he's obviously seeing how many fit all the way across, and I'm joining in with that game. What I noticed was that while he was being mathematical with those dominoes, he had a little mantra going, and he was going, oh, e, oh, ah, oh, e, oh, ah. Now, he's not started school yet in this photo. There are things called preschools. He's at some playgroups, but not playgroups that would have done counting. But he has grown up with two older brothers and heard them counting. And he's internalized that. So he's starting to teach himself how to count. I think children are being mathematical from the moment they're born. I think they're seeing patterns, they're ordering things, they're organizing things, and that is being mathematical. So children come to us being mathematical. I'm not going to read through that slide because the next slide, I think, gives you a better description of CPA, but that's often used as the definition. All I want to say is that pictorial doesn't mean drawing. Please don't ask your students to draw lots of things that they're working on, to draw the concrete objects. They're better off doing some mathematics than drawing what they're working on. Sometimes drawing is quite useful to create a bit of space for thinking. It can be quite meditative, but that's not what pictorial means. So CPA came from a psychologist called Martin Hughes. He was working in the 50s, so we're a long time before Singapore mathematics. And the experiment that he did with children was had 5 cubes in a box, showed the children there were 5 cubes in a box, took one out, and then asked them how many there were left in the box and to draw an image to help with their thinking. And those were the different sorts of images that children came up with. So some children literally drew the box with 4 things in and 1 taken out. And they could solve the problem by counting 1, 2, 3, 4 things left in the box. And he called that a concrete, working concretely. Some children drew the objects. So thought, I'm not going to draw the cubes. I'm going to draw 5 lines, 5 strokes, because there were 5 things. And then I can cross one out for the one that was taken out. That leaves me with 4. Okay. And he called that iconic. And then other ones use abstract mathematics. So they would say, well, that activity is the same as you asking me what's 5 subtract 1, and the answer is 4. So that's where the idea of CPA came from. So like I said, that was in the 50s. And again, Martin Hughes was working with somebody called David Woods, who was actually a student of Piaget. So it goes right back in history. So what does that look like in Max Maths? And I'll just quickly whiz through so you can see things, how things develop, and try and leave a little bit of time for questions at the end. I'm more than happy for you to put questions in all of the way through. So if you've got questions or comment like Rosa's made, please do put them in now and we'll come back to those at the end. So this is a page from the Stage 1 student book. And I hope you can see that there are 4 images of each number from 1 to 10. And I think there's at least a lesson there. Hopefully, you have concrete objects that students will be counting. As well as those, if you haven't, and in some places the classrooms are too big and they'll be sharing books for them to do that, you can actually be counting by touching the concrete objects on the page. So they're kind of pseudo concrete objects. And then there's the number written as a number and the number written as a word. And if I was working in a multilingual classroom, I would be creating a display where there was that word in the languages of the classroom as well. So that there's conversations between home and school. I think it's really important that we bring all of the languages of home into the classroom. And then we talked about the order irrelevance principle. I talked about the order irrelevance principle and subitizing. Subitizing means that we can quickly see how many there are without having to count. Subitizing has been around for a long time because dice have been around for a long time. And if you think about the representation of 5 on a dice, it's 2, 2 and a 1 in the middle. And we see that as 5. We don't see that as 2 and 2 and 1. And that's what subitizing is. So 8 there we're seeing as a 5 and a 3. So we know that as well as there being 8 things, 5 and 3 is 8. That's also 8. 4 and 4 is 8. So what I might be creating when I'm using this page is an 8 table. And I might ask children to go outside and collect me 8 leaves and 8 stones and 8 something else, or bring 8 for lids, bottle top lids from home. And we can arrange them in different ways so that they'll see all the different ways of making 8. And there you can see 10 as 2 5s. And that leads us on to using tens frames in the next stage. So a different form of representation. We can do this concretely by drawing tens frames and putting counters in the tens frame, or if they want, they can be counting on the page, like I said before. And you'll notice that the question at the bottom of the page, and in some ways that's the most important question, which number appeared most often? Okay, because all of those patterns look different, but actually some of them have the same number. That's not the end of the question. How many other ways can you make it? So how many different arrangements of 7 counters can I make in a tens frame? And what do you notice? Oh, there's always 3 left over. So I can see 8 quickly by just looking for 2 blanks without counting. I can see 7 by looking for 3 blanks. And that's also telling me that 8 and 2 is 10 and 7 and 3 is 10. And that's the pictorial representation. But you can see it's also concrete because you can be literally putting counters in tens frames. I talked about tens rods and ones and hundreds rods. It's great if you've got them in the classroom. I think if you haven't, just having the image, the pictorial representation of them helps, and linking that to an abacus. And there's a game there. We haven't got time to guess a number. We were going to spend some time, if this was a 90-minute webinar, like they often are, we would have time for me to say, guess what the number is on the next slide, by asking me questions to which you could only answer yes or no. And that was going to be the number, which is sort of today's day, 61,025. Moving on to the next stage and thinking about number lines. And you'll see that one of the avatars is kind of saying you're allowed to use number lines. This is a perfectly good mathematical activity. And the other avatar saying, you know what, if the number's quite close to 10, I can use that fact to do a mental calculation. So what this is a pictorial representation of mental methods. So if I'm calculating 742 plus 32 mentally, I might well say 742 plus 30 plus 2, and that gets me to 774, which is what that representation of the numbers does. I might do 2 and then 30, so I could work it in that way. And then number 3, if I'm trying to add 29 to 263, I can add 30 and then take 1 away, and that's what that number line shows. So and I think by now we're towards the end of 3 years of using Max Maths. We're becoming quite refined in the sort of representations that we're using. And that's the idea of the spiral curriculum. So the Singapore bit, if you like, is that idea of spiral curriculum, that idea of using concrete materials that you've seen, and now developing different forms of representations. More concrete, more pictorial representations, place value counters, developing into place value grids. So we're kind of becoming more abstract, but still occasionally going back to concrete materials, and that making sense of what a place value grid does. It's just making it easier. It's just saying I've got 2 100s counters, or I've got 3 100s counters. And then the last slide, then we'll just have a couple of minutes for questions. Now moving up to thinking about more abstract, so thinking about square numbers, which some people see as abstract. If I had my time again, I would probably have the heads together at the top of the page and let's practice underneath, and I'll explain why in a minute. But I want you to focus on the heads together. And one of the joys of being a teacher is you can make that decision. So when you do page 12, I think it's stage 4, might be stage 5, you have my permission. In fact, I'm ordering you to do the heads together activity first, because that explains what square numbers are. And what I'm drawing people's attention to is both the squareness of square numbers, because people don't always see that. A square number is called a square number because it's a square. So you can see that's a 2 by 2 square, and there are 4 smaller squares inside. But it's also 1 plus 3. And what I want the students to work on in groups is just developing that pattern and noticing what the numbers are. And one of the joys of doing workshops in person is teachers bringing photographs in of their students working on things. And that's a classroom in Belize, in the southern part of Belize, in Toledo district. And you can see that the students have brought in lots of different coloured bottle tops from home, or cowrie shells from home, and they're creating that pattern. So you can see the growing pattern of square numbers up to, how many have they got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 17 squared they're going up to. But noticing that they're all adding odd numbers. So 1 plus 3, 1 plus 3 plus 5, 1 plus 3 plus 5 plus 7. And then we can use that to complete the Lex Practice grid. And that's what I mean by learning mathematics through engaging with an activity. I don't have to say these are called square numbers, because the students can see that they're square numbers. And that kind of proved to me that there'd been a point in writing Max Maths. If kids in the rural schools in Belize, look at their faces, they're really, really engaged in it. I know we're not supposed to have children's faces on slides, and they're not, but you can kind of see the joy there. Okay, well, I think we've got about two minutes. I would really welcome some comments or thoughts. If there's anything in particular that you think you'll take away from this session, jot it down for me. It really helps me to know what it is that people are taking away from sessions. When I run sessions live, we always do a round of the whole workshop, no matter how many people there are, and they'll either just say a word or a sentence about something they're taking away. So I will be really grateful if you do come in and just type a brief sentence, or even just a word about what you're taking away from it. Was there anything in particular that you enjoyed, Temi Tope? And again, I'm sorry if I said your name incorrectly. I'm genuinely interested in the particular sections. Okay, I think it's really important, Claudia, that when we're talking kind of theoretically, we use specific examples, and that's why my grandchildren are just great at giving me examples. No problem, Marcella. That's why you write books. Thanks, Claudia.
I believe we got a question from Roses earlier. It says here, please correct me if I'm wrong, subsizing is being able to arrange a number in different ways.
That's a way of, subitizing is a skill rather than activity. So subitizing is if I roll a dice and it comes up on a 6, you know it's 6 without having to count 6 dots. Thanks about Temi Tope about saying using concrete objects. And there's research that showed that the higher the number that people can subitize, so if I just throw a random number of cubes down, if I throw 9 cubes down on a desk, if students can very quickly kind of arrange them into, oh, there's 4 over there and 5 over there, and say there are 9 without having to count, that's the skill of subitizing. So we can teach the skill of subitizing by saying things like, how many different ways can we arrange objects to make 7? So it could be 1 and 6, or 2 and 5, or 3 and 4, or 2 and 2 and 2 and 1. And that's how we teach the skill of subitizing.
Lovely, thank you. And thank you for your lovely comments in the chat. Great to see that.
Yeah,
and
thank you.
And thank you to Tony for hosting today's webinar.
An absolute pleasure. No,
Absolutely.
and thank you for joining in. Thanks, Muna. Manipulatives are so important. And I hope one of the other things that you might take away is that we can create manipulatives using materials that children see at home. It doesn't have to be fancy manipulatives. And in some ways, I prefer it if we create our own manipulatives with the kids and with their parents, because it locates mathematics in their experience, not externally. So thank you for that. Yeah, thanks, Stacey. Listening time. It changes the nature of the classroom as well. I think it completely changes. Students feel heard, and we feel more valued in a way because we can hear them talking about what we're doing.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. So as I said at the beginning of the session, you'll be receiving an email shortly with a certificate of attendance for you to keep, as well as a link to a survey if you'd like to give us feedback on this session. I believe the survey will also open up as soon as this webinar ends, so you can go straight there. Don't forget, you'll also be receiving a recording and slides of the webinar when they're available. I think that's it from me. Anything else you'd like to say, Tony?
No, just to say my email there is deliberate. If anybody wants to carry on the conversation, I'm very open to you emailing me with any questions or thoughts.
Lovely. Okay, I think that's it.
I think so.
Thank you very much for attending today, and we'll see you later.
Bye-bye. Thank you.